know that it's actually, ah, well, there we go. No mistaking that as the, um, thanks for that, Becky, for the introduction and the admin info. Yeah, I'm Michael. I'm the Shared Lives Plus Senior Policy and External Affairs Officer. You've probably seen my name flash up on the Google group emails or in various other capacities. I've been at Shared Lives Plus for about 8 years. And Kathy is my brilliant assistant today, and she's been around even longer than me. Um, so I'm led to believe this is a webinar, which means that you can see me and I can't see you. Um, you're not able to unmute and talk within the session itself. I'm sure there will be some questions. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat as we go along. Kathy will collect them and sort of remind me of them because we've got a bit of time built in at the end for Q&A. So I'll try and address questions that you've got then. I can't promise that I'll be able to answer them all or even any of them uh, at the time because oftentimes, shared lives queries tend to be weird and unique and complicated. But if I can't answer them today, then I'll certainly take them away and follow up with you afterwards by email or otherwise. So yeah, let's get cracking. So today's session, as the title suggests, is all about the surprisingly complex topic of shared lives carer fees. And specifically, it's about the structure of shared lives carer income and the mechanisms by how it's paid. Um, we're going to explore the background of where the different elements of that income come from, what they're for, and then as schemes, best practice relating to those shared lives care income streams. Now, you'll notice there that I was saying income rather than fees, and I think maybe I should have titled this session income because I think in some ways, as we'll see, um, fees to describe all aspects of a live-in shared lives carer's income, using that term can be a little bit misleading. Um, so what we're going to cover in detail is the three-part shared lives care income model, which I think has been called in some places and in some cases the citizenship model or the citizen model in the past. Then we're going to talk about the individual components of that, or rather two of the three. So specifically rent for uh, shared lives carers with live-in long-term arrangements, so rent, food and utilities, and then we're going to go over just recap some important principles in practice. Um, and finally, we will have some time for questions at the end, as I said. So, one thing that we won't be covering today in detail is the care and support fee levels. So specifically the care and support fee, how that's benchmarked, with the different bandings, etc., and what level that should be set at. The only reason we're not covering that is because it's a massive topic and a complex and massive topic in its own right. And Shared Lives Plus are planning a major piece of work about this, which we'll be drawing on, I think, a lot of external expertise and support because as I say, it's a complicated topic, but it is definitely something that we're thinking about and working on. So, these aspects of shared lives care income and the fees. The structure and the mechanisms for pay are also extremely, there's a lot to talk about. And so it's worthy of a session in its own right, we felt. Okay, so um, just to start off with a bit of, we'll just kind of give a basic overview of shared lives carer fees and shared lives carer income in general. So all shared lives carers receive a fee for the care and support that they provide. They Shared lives carers are self-employed, so they don't receive wages or a salary in the same way that waged employees would. But they do work. They are working as they provide care and support for the person, and their fees that they receive are the remuneration for that work. And now every shared lives carer that's got a long-term live-in arrangement That is to say, where the person that they support moves in with them and they share their home and family life. Also receive two other um, contributions basically from the supported person. The first of those is rent, and that's for the room that the supported person occupies. And the second is a contribution to cover the cost of the utilities that they use in the house, and the meals provided to them the shared lives by the shared lives carer. However, that is stipulated at the start of the arrangement. Those two contributions-based elements are almost always paid out of the supported person's benefits, unless they're a self-funder, in which case they've got a certain level of savings or income, which means that there's certain means-tested benefits that they might not have access to. In that situation, they're probably also likely paying for their own care and support as well, but that's a very small minority of cases. So those contributions are almost always paid out of the person's benefits. And then in the case of rent, specifically, they're paid by, well, in the past and in a minority of cases, housing benefit, but more increasingly now, it's the housing component of universal credit. So, um, yeah, that's a brief overview and introduction of the model of shared lives care fees, specifically those with long-term living arrangements, which I think most people on the call will already know. Um, Now, the so the first important bit of guidance that or the first important part of our position on this topic is about the importance of this three-part model being a three-part model. So it's really vital, basically, to consider and communicate about shared life care income in these three distinct components. Um, and that in especially important. I mean, that really means communicating to the carers about the differences, about those different income streams. And that's crucial, even if shared life schemes collect the rental and food and utilities contribution from the supported person and then pass it on to the shared lives carer along with the care and support fee in one lump sum. Um, we know a lot of schemes do it like that. Um, but even in those cases, it's really important that the different amounts are detailed clearly on any remittance notice that the shared lives carers receive for their fees, and on basically on any other official literature about fees as well. I mean, we'd recommend it's used even in marketing and recruitment. Um, so the reason that that is so important, or there are several reasons, but the underlying reason is that those different types of income are the ones that we outlined earlier, the three parts, are from different sources and they fundamentally differ in nature. So, as I said, care and support fees are remuneration for work done, paid by a commission and organisation, which is usually an adult social care budget within the local authority. Um, it can also be from a continuing healthcare pot or from another health commission and organisation or funding pot. Um, the rent and the food and utilities contributions are the terms of a license agreement between the shared lives care and the supported person. And with that in mind, they are to some extent, or even to a large extent, best considered as a private commercial matter between two private parties. So on the one hand, the landlord, which is what the shared lives carer is in this context, and then on the other hand, the lodger, which is what the supported person is in this context. Um, even where even where the supported person is on housing benefit rather than universal credit, meaning that their housing support is paid by the local authority rather than by DWP. Um, it's ultimately their money which they're entitled to pay for their accommodation costs, just as the shared lives care is totally within their rights to charge an amount for the room that they're renting to them. Um, conflating those different income sources prevents clarity about their source, their respective sources, and their purpose ultimately. And that can lead to all sorts of consequences, but basically it means that shared lives carers can be unsure about how much they're being paid for their work, and how much they're being paid for their rent, where the different sums of money are coming from, what level the different sums are at, etc. Um, we've experienced in a couple, in a number of cases in the past that where where a person's supported person's rental contribution has effectively been subsidizing basically a pretty low, in some cases unacceptably low care and support fee. But shared lives carers haven't been aware of the of that of how it's all broken down and aren't aware of how little they're getting for the actual work that they're doing as part of their actual fees that they're paid. Um, and you know, I'm sure all of us, even despite the differences between a self-employed and an employed person, um, everybody will understand, intuitively how important that clarity and transparency is for the purposes of recruitment and retention, but also just as a matter of basic fairness, really. People need to know how much they're being paid for what and where the money's coming from. Um, now, I mentioned earlier that this clear distinction and separation between the elements is important, even where schemes pay a gross or a lump sum amount to the shared lives carer and recoup, either prior to the payment or after it, recoup the contributions-based elements from the supported person. Um, I can't say for definite yet because it's research that's actively ongoing. I think, though, I expect that we will be producing guidance in the sort of near to medium term future that that model of organizing and structuring payments is probably not the best one to do. Um, there is a risk if the shared life scheme collects the rent from the supported person, even if it is then to be passed on to the shared lives carer, there is a risk because they are collecting rent payments that the scheme could then be perceived as a letting agent in legal terms. So I need to still work out through the different permutations, and like I say, we will be issuing guidance on this sooner or later. Um, I know a lot of schemes do it that way, and there are good reasons why. Just just for one thing, in many cases, a supported person might struggle to pay their rent for whatever reason, and the scheme uh, will almost front the cost of that and pass it on to the carer, and then they assume the burden of having to recover the money from the supported person, which is a nice, a good and kind of protective way of making sure that element of a shared lives carer's income stream is protected. Um, and I think there are other historic reasons why the gross lump sum payment model pervades as well. So firstly, shared lives in many ways, when it was set up, was modeled on the fostering system. I mean, there are many similarities between the two models. And in fostering, of course, uh, the fostering allowance, the income that a foster carer gets for fostering, also theoretically contains the different streams of money for different things. So, there's money for them actually being a fosterer and doing the fostering itself. But also there's payment involved to cover the cost of raising a child in one's household. So, feeding, clothing, food and utilities, all manner of other things. Um, but of course, the key difference between shared lives and fostering is that shared lives is for adults. And when a person turns 18, they are entitled to draw down benefits, and they're also have an obligation to pay their own way when it comes to things like food and accommodation. So, whereas with fostering, everything has to be paid from the state in that holistic way. So it makes sense to just kind of roll it all into one. In shared lives, that difference between children and adults means that's not the sort of optimum way to do it. Um, and I think there are also it's also understandable from the perspective that in the past, um, before universal credit came in, and everybody's housing support was just paid by housing benefit. Housing benefit, unlike, as I said before, unlike universal credit, is administered and still paid by local authorities themselves. And I think in the past, it may have been the disposition of Shared Life Services and the local authority to say, well, look, the care and support fees are being paid by us ultimately out of social care budgets, and the accommodation costs ultimately being paid by us through housing benefits. So, it doesn't matter to what extent it's kind of delineated or separated. So, I can easily imagine that that's how it was thought of. But yeah, it's ultimately it's still, as I said before, it's important to think about the fact that it's the supported person's money really, and they are acting as an adult and to some degree an independent adult in the world, and their ability to pay their own rent using their own money, even if it's ultimately state provided, is an important part of the arrangement. So, so that's the kind of the importance of the three-part model, and specifically treating it as a three-part model, and that means communicating openly about it, clearly and transparently about the different income streams to the carers, even to supported people, and in general in official literature and formal discussions about it in the scheme. Um, so. We're now going to talk about the two contributions-based elements, the first of which is about the rent. Um, Lots of schemes often wonder how the rental rate in a shared lives arrangement should be set. What rate should it be set at? How do you derive that sum, as it were? Um, so firstly, I'd say it's worth thinking about what the rental part of a shared lives arrangement actually is. And this is where we look back to what we said earlier, in the principles we talked about in the previous section, which is that this part of a shared lives arrangement is best thought of as a private commercial arrangement between the two parties. And the implication of that is that it's not for the scheme to authoritatively set a rental rate, particularly if one of the or both of the two parties don't agree to it. Um, Now, that's probably quite a shift in the way a lot of schemes in the network will see this. And it was a bit of a shift, to be honest, for me and for us at Shared Lives Plus as well. Um, but it's that different way of thinking about it is the product of a lot of research and legal advice. And I have to say, the more I think about it, the more it makes sense. Because since the end of controlled rent tenancies, I think in the 1980s, there is actually no legal authority in the UK for any third party or third body to enforce what a person can and can't charge for their rent. Um, the legal advice we had was that if a scheme were to be seen as setting and insisting on a particular rental rate, this could make them letting agents in the eyes of the law. In fact, it seems very likely that they would be classed as letting agents. The consequences of being classed as letting agents the full extent of those aren't clear yet to me. But I do know that there are a host of legal obligations on letting agents, which schemes will certainly want to avoid, which we'd all want to avoid. So, because of that, our guidance is that it's for the supported person and the shared lives carer um, to agree the amount of rent that's paid at the beginning of the match, and that should be established on the license agreement, and then reconsidered and renewed whenever that license agreement is renewed. And the best practice for the renewal of the license agreement, we think, is to do it annually for various reasons. So while the scheme shouldn't look to enforce a rate, but it does have a role to facilitate a good arrangement and to make sure that neither party is getting a bad deal. So the rates that are established on the license agreement as the rent should be fair and reasonable to both parties, so that on the one hand, the shared lives carer is receiving a reasonable amount of rent for their room, and on the other, the supported person who often will, as I said before, will only have benefits to pay their rent with, and who also might be less well resourced to judge, good value for money than others might, to ensure that they pay a fair rate and then they're not getting ripped off. And as I say, the scheme has a facilitating role in this. Um, and I think this is where probably, there's probably a little bit of them, it may be a bit perturbing or daunting to think that, oh God, we've got to facilitate a sort of in-depth negotiation at the start of each match about what rent should be paid. And that could be a lot of extra admin work. It could be a bit anarchic. But in reality, not a great deal actually needs to change, and it's really just a subtle change of emphasis, I suppose, in maybe how schemes have viewed this topic before. So schemes are, when they facilitate the signing of a license agreement at the start, they are playing that facilitating role. Um, and there is a solution which is really a best of both worlds, is best outcome for everybody. So the scheme can propose the local housing allowance rate for the postcode that the shared lives carers property is in, and set that as the proposed rental amount on the license agreement. So you can use there is a government local housing allowance rate calculator that you can go into online. It's in our guidance, which I'll share later. You just simply type in the postcode, and it comes up with what the rate will be. The reason why this is the best outcome for all is that it will be the maximum amount that the shared lives carer can receive in rent for their room, without the supported person being out of pocket and having to find that money from some other source, because they're guaranteed pretty much to be paid, to be awarded that LHA rate. It will cover the entirety of it, so they don't have to scrabble around trying to cobble together extra money from their other benefits or from other sort of meager sources of income to pay it. The local housing allowance rate, as I said, is the maximum sum that the DWP will award to claimants for housing support in any given area. Um, it's as another good reason to sort of check and renew the license agreement annually is that LHA rate may increase. Some years they don't. For a long time they were frozen, but they're at least reissued every year at the start of every financial year. So it's always worth checking, because it may go up, and it's a way, using this is a way of trying to maximize the shared lives carers' income, basically. So within the LHA rate, there are differences. In fact, there are several different rates, contingent on a supported on an applicant's circumstances. Um, it's kind of tricky, this, because in a sense, the strict definition. So the important distinction for us to think about is the difference between a shared accommodation rate of local housing allowance, which is lower, and the one bedroom rate, which is higher, sometimes as much as double. Uh, in When you look at the legislation and the regulations behind universal credit and housing benefit, actually, the criteria for the different rates uh, are described categories of accommodation. And when you look at those descriptions, really shared lives arrangements are a shared accommodation arrangement, because shared accommodation denotes any arrangement where the person doesn't have exclusive use of bedroom, kitchen, bathroom, possibly living space as well. I can't remember. But anyway, in any case, it's not, shared lives, people supported in shared lives don't have exclusive use of those things. They share all of them. But uh, so yeah, so theoretically they're in a shared accommodation situation, but particularly with universal credit, that doesn't actually matter, and it's almost a loophole in the system, really. But the universal credit system was set up in order to reduce the amount of human decision making and discretion in the assessment and award of benefits. So instead of the claim going to an individual, which, carefully considers the merits and the characteristics of the accommodation that the person's living in, instead, the award is just based on certain kind of flat criteria about the claimant. Um, and now most people under the age of 35, under this kind of blanket system, are only eligible for the lower shared accommodation rate. But um, people in shared lives, the vast majority of, I'd say 99.9% of people in shared lives, will actually qualify for an exemption from that shared accommodation rate because because of certain criteria that they fulfill. They may receive disability living allowance, the daily living component of personal independence payments. There might be a care leaver. There's a full list of the exemption criteria, which is linked to in a piece of guidance that I'm going to share at the end. But it's suffice to say that most people in shared lives will be eligible for the one bedroom rate if they're on universal credit. Now, if they're in receipt of housing benefit, the legacy benefit, things are slightly different. They may have a slightly weaker claim to the one bedroom rate, but actually, again, there is uh, an exemption from the shared accommodation rate if the person is in receipt of severe disability premium. So I've had a look at the legislation. I'm pretty confident that that is the case. I'm in dialogue with the ministerial correspondence team at the DWP to try and get this confirmed. And once it is, I'll be updating our guidance to reflect that as well. But I already know that there are from individual anecdotes from cases with schemes across the country that some people are on housing benefit and they're also receiving the one bedroom rate. So that one bedroom rate is higher than the shared accommodation rate. It's worth going for that, putting that on the license as the proposed amount on the license agreement, because as I said, it's the maximum amount that the supported person can draw down in benefits, and therefore it's the maximum amount that the shared lives carer will be able to receive for their room rent. And as I say, there doesn't need to be a great deal of negotiation and kind of wrangling if it's clear to both parties that this is the best outcome for them. So that's that on the rent. Moving on to the food and utilities contribution. Um, Again, we're operating under the same principle as the one we discussed when we talked about the rental rates. So it's a private commercial arrangement really between two parties. It's part of the license agreement. It's for the shared lives care and the person they support to establish these fees at the beginning of the match, and then whenever the license agreement is renewed, ideally annually. Once again, the shared life scheme's role is to facilitate the signing of that agreement with sort of the principles of fairness and reasonableness in mind. So the rate set out on the license agreement must got to be fair and reasonable to both parties, so that on the one hand, the shared lives care isn't sort of subsidizing the person's keep at home, and that they're fairly reimbursed for food, fuel, and various other household costs. And then on the other hand, it needs to be such that the supported person, who again often only has benefits to pay this contribution, and who might be less resourced to judge value for money, pays a fair rate, and that's particularly important for energy bills. I mean, it's important for all aspects of it, but it's particularly important for energy bills because overcharging for energy bills is against the Ofgem regulations, and overcharging is basically any person, any landlord who takes in a lodger who then who takes money off them as a contribution towards bills is theoretically, technically an energy reseller. So there are Ofgem regulations against overcharging in energy resale, basically. And again, in one of the pieces of guidance we linked to at the end, there is a link to the details of those Ofgem rules. So yeah, the really this aspect of the contributions is a bit less straightforward than rent because unlike the rental, uh, the obligation to pay rent that a supported person has, um, they do not receive a dedicated benefit payment that will cover this cost. supported people have to come up with this charge for food and fuel and all the other amenities out of the rest of their benefits, which in many cases can be quite meager, which is why it's especially important to think about the person's overall finances and to make sure that they're not getting ripped off, basically. Um, one one potential solution that which is something that we've advocated for in the past and we still have it as part of our guidance now is that schemes could use the DWP's ineligible costs, which are also sometimes called deductions, as a guide rate. So these are basically a series of rates with a series of sums of money attached to different categories. So hot meals and then gas and electricity usage, which the DWP will deduct from an award of housing benefit or universal credit if they suspect that the rental charge a person's being issued with includes a charge for food and fuel. So it's basically a way of universal credit making sure they don't pay for anything other than rent. Um, and that probably it's probably most relevant in cases where someone's in supported accommodation or they're in a hostel or something like that, where, like they get a sort of bed and breakfast service as well, and they're charged for all of it. So that's one reason why we always say on the license agreement, it's important to sharply delineate between food and utilities contribution and the rental contribution to make sure that DWP don't think that everything's been rolled into one charge. Um, so the reason the reason we propose this is because it's actually the only government issued approximation of weekly household food and fuel costs. And the way you would do this is you'd look at how many meals, for example, the shared lives care has agreed to provide the supported person per week. And then there are costs associated with that in the DWP's guidance. And then you top that up, add it all together with the food and fuel. And then if it's three meals a day for across the week, I think the current charge, though the current ineligible cost deduction is something like 70 or 80 pounds. I should probably know that off the top of my head, but I don't. But it's around that. Um, and depending on where you live and what's going on, that is, that could be a reasonable amount to contribute. It could be higher, or it could be, in a lot of cases, it could also be lower. So it's an imperfect guideline. And as we've all seen the extent to which, especially food and fuel, but how much household costs can really soar and inflate. So it's a tricky one. Um, but Yeah, so that nominal contribution might not always accurately represent real household costs. And again, those deduction amounts will change, not every year. Again, sometimes they're frozen, but they can change. So it's worth checking them annually. And the time to do that is, again, the best time would be when renewing the license agreement once per year. As I think alluded to, that amount may well fall quite short of, or at least, or won't represent accurately uh, the actual cost of household amenities that the supported person uses. And so shared life schemes might want to facilitate a more tailored agreement for each match. And in fact, really, this is probably the fairest way to do this. So I know several schemes across the country already do this, and they do so by tracking evidence of actual costs and working out a personal contribution from the supported person based on that. So special consideration could also be given to where a supported person is likely to incur higher costs through increased food and fuel use, um, and also maybe where the home, for whatever characteristics the home is, unusual characteristics the home has got, where it might the costs to heat the home might significantly differ from the average. Um, and then also there's a strong case to consider also the cost of other shared amenities that the supported person is likely to use, including internet, phone, or television subscriptions. And I suppose the principle there would be, is the shared lives carer likely to have to pay for these without this if they didn't have the supported person living with them? Um, And yeah, so that's a kind of principle that you could consider when deciding this. Now, of course, again, this probably feels like, oh, what a faff that's going to be, having to work out tailored food and utilities contributions in every case. And again, that's why we still propose that the schemes are proposing a guide rate at the start of each match, that an eligible cost sum can be that guideline. And then really it'd probably be for the carer at some point later on to say, look, my food and fuel bills have gone through the roof here. I don't think this contribution still covers it. Um, and then it'd be up to and then the process would be that the shared lives carers kind of would have to evidence, the increase and evidence the disparity between the two things. But you've got to think to yourself, really, the key is to kind of treat this aspect of the arrangement as a normal private lodging arrangement. And anyone who's on the call who's ever taken a room, has ever been a lodger somewhere, you know that the landlord will probably say to you, look, this is the rent, and then I ask for this much for a contribution towards bills at the start of, at the every month. And then 9 times out of 10, if it looks reasonable, people will just kind of say, yeah, that's fine. Because again, it's all about trying to create a fair and reasonable settlement. And in most cases, if as long as it doesn't look ridiculous, I think both parties will be happy to come to uh, an estimate at the start, and then you can sort of take it from there. So um, that's kind of dealing with the detail of the different contributions based elements, and of course the three-part payment model. So I just want to recap now on what we've discussed and just reinforce some important principles in practice for schemes that are helping to facilitate matches who are coming up against questions around how to set rates, what level they should be set at and how they should be paid. So yeah, I mean, absolutely paramount is importance is clarity around the income streams. It's so important that shared lives carers know which parts of their income come from where and what level they're at. Secondly, the freedom to negotiate is actually an important right in these arrangements. Now, that doesn't necessarily need to be shouted from the rooftops when the shared lives care and the supported person are being introduced to the concepts. As I say, not a lot necessarily needs to change if the schemes sort of follow best practice, but it's important to know that either party has the right um, to challenge an aspect of the license, and ultimately both parties have the right to walk away. So if the shared lives carer insists on a rate of rent that's too high, the supported person doesn't have to agree to pay that, and they can say, look, they can walk away from the arrangement. Likewise, the shared lives carer has the freedom to do that as well. If they think they simply cannot afford to provide a home to a supported person for at a particular rate, then they're free to say, look, I don't want to do this. Obviously, nobody really wants that outcome, including probably the two parties. So the schemes have that facilitating role to come to a fair agreement. And so schemes, the ideal settlement is to propose rates on template license agreements. Um, and that's kind of what schemes have always been doing already anyway. But I suppose the thing I want to stress today is that schemes don't have the authority to enforce a particular rate. If one party challenges it, the scheme has to take that challenge seriously. For example, as I mentioned with one of the stipulations of the Ofgem regulations before about charging for fuel for energy use is um, a lodger or a person that's kind of buying the energy from the reseller or from the landlord, they have a right to ask how that was worked out. So if they say, look, I don't really necessarily agree with what I'm being charged here, they can demand to see how the reseller, the landlord, has worked out that sum. So that's one thing to kind of take into account. So yeah, so the scheme's role is to facilitate the signing of the license agreement with fairness for both parties in mind. Um, Especially where the best practice that we've kind of discussed is followed, because especially where, especially in terms of rent, there is a best outcome scenario, and where that's proposed, we can't see any reason why that would be challenged by either party. Um, I suppose connected to that freedom that both parties have got as commercial agents in this relationship is shared lives carers self-employment status, which, as I'm sure most people will know, that self-employment status is vital um, to the shared lives, to the operation of the shared lives model. And part of the test of their self-employment is around the level of control that a putative employer would have. And I think if schemes were too authoritative around setting rental, food, and utilities bills, this wouldn't allow the carer enough flexibility and freedom to be really considered self-employed. And then finally, I think all the points that we've discussed so far really point to the importance of the license agreement and getting that set up with all of this information clearly demarcated on it at the very start of the arrangement. And like I say, to renew it regularly, ideally annually. Um, we've heard it's sort of incredible to me, but I've heard of cases where, there hasn't been a license agreement at the start, things haven't been established, where these terms haven't been established, and that can cause untold problems further down the line. Now, we've got template license agreements as part of our guidance, and they were refreshed and edited and reviewed not too long ago with the express help of solicitors. So they're really, really robust in terms of protecting things like self-employment status. So we'd always advocate for using those templates. So again, I'll link to those, and you can have a look at those at your leisure. And if you're not using them, and if you're wondering how to structure a license agreement, they can really help. So finally, yeah, this is just everything today. All the information I've shared today is available already in our guidance area, specifically in the info bank and the Shared Lives Plus guidance sections. It's all the information is drawn from that. I've gone into a little bit more detail today, a little bit of the background and the things underlying it, but all the key principles are outlined in here. I realize now that you can't click on these links because it is a PowerPoint, but I'll cut and paste them into the chat shortly. And yeah, so you can find out more about all of this here. And now, finally, we're a little bit over time, but we do have some time for questions at the end. And I'm going to check the chat now. In fact, do you know what? I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think, do I need to show anything else? Uh, well, I have one more slide which says thanks for listening. Yes, thanks very much for listening. I'm aware it's a lot of information to take in. I've talked a lot. So I'm going to stop sharing now and ask if there are any questions.
There's quite a lot in the chat actually, Michael. Would you
Also,
like
I
me
see
to
20,
summarize them for you?
28. Yeah, I can. If there are any, if you know it, if you can see them already, Kathy,
Yeah,
I'd be grateful.
I've kind of summarized them. So the first one was when did the three-part citizen model start? How long ago? And has it
Mm,
changed recently? I don't think it's a recent change, is it?
mm. Yeah, I'll address that one first. Simply put, I don't know. I know that it was in guidance when I arrived at Shared Lives Plus 8 years ago. And it's something that it was something that was talked about. So it definitely it's definitely been around for a while. And I think certainly the concept of this combined income stream, so care and support fees and rent and the food and utilities contribution, I think that has been around in whatever form from the very start of the shared lives model. Because, like I say, in some ways it is the same as fostering, and that's how, and a lot of the kind of mechanisms and structures of the model were kind of copied from fostering. Um, but yeah, it'd been interesting. I don't know. I've not seen it called the citizen model for a while now. So that'd be something to have a look. I can have a look into that and find out. Um,
One of the schemes has said that they have a lump sum. but they break down the amounts for the carers each April of the financial year, and they were wondering if that is sufficient.
Well, I suppose if it's then broken down into annual income, um, then the carer is clear on what they're receiving, and that's the key principle is that the shared lives carers understand which bit is coming from where and how much it is. But I would say that if they're having to wait a year before they understand that distinction, that's probably a bit too long. I mean, I think it would be best to communicate what the different rates are at the start. And really, it should be clear also by deduction, really, from because the rent and the food and utilities contributions should be detailed clearly on the license agreement itself. So it's fine to break it down like, yeah, I suppose it'd be fine to break it down like that in terms of literature, but yeah, I would prefer if the carers, well, certainly it'd be important for the carers to be clear on the differences right from the start and sort of throughout. But I do know remittance notice practice varies and is issued differently across schemes.
Um, Andy just says in the chat there that the three-part model started over 20 years ago, so it's been around a while.
Oh, nice one.
There was a worry about there being free rein for people, for carers setting the food and utilities, but I think you've explained that
Mm,
as part of the presentation.
yeah.
Um, One of the schemes was worried about the claim gap when young people come over at 18. So that issue is when they're claiming universal credit and they have to wait 4 to 6 weeks. And so essentially the carer doesn't have that rental money and possibly the food and utilities money for up to 6 weeks. And is there anything they
Mm.
can do, or do they have to just sit and wait that out?
Yeah, so I mean, even universal credit, there's a minimum 5 week gap in every case. Um, uh, in terms of because we've had queries recently as well about deposits. So in a lot of cases, in a private rental arrangement, will ask you for a month's rent in advance and a deposit. Now at the moment, deposits aren't part of our guidance, but we're considering doing it. But then the problem we've got is to wondering how can that be? How would the supported person actually pay that upfront without having received the benefit? So it's something for us to think about the claim gap, but it should the claim should always pay the entirety of the person's rent, even if it has to be backdated and needs to be waited for. So there should never be a period where the person's got to pay rent and that Universal Credit doesn't pay it. But it may be that the date of charge needs to be clearly delineated on the application. And I think that's our universal credit guidance is due for review, including the technical parts of the application. So that might be something that we address in that. Um, but I would stress that it's really important to get the license agreement agreed nice and early, ideally before the match starts, so that that can be used and the application can be sent off as early as possible, so that the delay is as short as possible. The claim gap.
Um, Moving on to contributions, someone was wondering about the age of contributions, and say if you have children in the household and the amount to be paid is divided amongst everyone in the household, and some children obviously that they're the parents' responsibility. So how do you work that out fairly? What age does contributions start?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, and Kathy, I know that you've had experience of schemes having taking a shared lives cares complaint seriously about, saying, well, look, these contributions really don't cover the cost of this person's food and fuel use. And then the scheme has facilitated a sort of bit of an investigation into those household costs and have found that the shared lives care wasn't factoring in the cost that their adults or other children incur. Um, I mean, I would say it seems pretty straightforward to me that yeah, I mean, if it's a child that if it's a child that doesn't have their own source of income yet and can't pay their own way, I would expect that the shared lives carer would foot that bill. You would still divide the costs of household amenities by however many people are in the household, but the shared lives the person supported in shared lives should only pay for one person's worth. They shouldn't be contributing towards the cost of of what the child of what a child is using. That's for the parents to cover. See, that seems to me pretty yeah, I would say that.
Um, Joe was saying about shared lives not being recognised by Universal Credit on the form, and
Mhm.
Mandy's helpfully shared what you shared with her last year around the difference between shared lives and supported living and other
That's right, yeah.
models. So I think Joe can come back to us if you need any more help on that, Joe. But
Yeah,
that
I would
does
just
tell
say
you a lot.
that is also not that is all that we do have that we've got we've got that information about how it's separate from supported accommodation because one of the issues is so sometimes people are passed from pillar to post in their claim because housing benefit will say you should claim universal credit will say you should claim housing benefit. Really, it's universal. It should be universal credit in virtually every case, unless the person's of pensionable age. Every new claim for housing support should be to universal credit. And the only exceptions are where a person is in supported accommodation, which in the housing in the regulations is called specified or exempt accommodation. Now, examples of that specified or exempt accommodation include supported accommodation, and sometimes shared lives is mistaken for that. But yes, there's clear delineation in law that shared lives is a separate model to supported accommodation. But there's also case law in which a Social Security Commissioner proved basically that shared lives isn't supported accommodation and that it's its own class, so it should be for universal credit. And then finally there is a connected concern about this sometimes is in shared lives not being on the options to tick for accommodation in a universal credit claim. In those situations, persons should always click private landlord because that's ultimately what the shared lives carer is in this context to them. They are their private landlord. Now I know for a fact that isn't in our universal credit guidance at the moment, so that's going to go in there as part of the update.
Moving on to the local housing allowance.
Yes.
Um, Someone's asked if they can average the local housing allowance across all of the areas they cover, so that it's fair for everybody. Would that be acceptable?
Um, Again, you could do that and propose it, but I don't really see how that would work in practice because basically it really it's better to treat each match individually. It might seem unfair that one person gets more rent for their house than another, but that there is no legal reason to therefore downgrade the amount of rent that someone could otherwise receive for their room, if you see what I mean. There's no legal authority to kind of do that. And when you think about it on the private market, there would be no cause or legal reason to reduce somebody's rent. I don't really see how it would work in practice either because the LHA rate is the maximum that the DWP would award. So if you're creating an average so that in some areas they're charging actually slightly lower than what the person would be entitled to of the LHA rate, that means that in some areas they'd be charging higher than what the person would be eligible for in the for the LHA rate. So I don't see how that would actually work in practice because the LHA rate is the maximum. The DWP will only ever pay the lowest, of course, the lowest of either what's on the actual license agreement, what the person's being actually charged in rent, or the LHA rate. They're obviously always trying to minimize how much they're going to pay out. So it may be that the only way I could see that would could work in practice is if maybe they're claiming for the shared accommodation rate rather than the LA rather than the one bedroom rate. But um, yeah, it feels unfair that that everybody can receive different rents, but that is ultimately the fact of that's a fact of life across that's what it's like in the private market and shared lives doesn't certainly schemes don't have the authority to sort of even that up or change that. Um, yeah.
And somebody's also said around the local housing allowance, can they just say category B rate on the license agreement? Because then they don't have to renew the license agreement every year, but that's different issue, isn't it? Because the license agreement should be renewed every year to
Yeah,
keep
the
it.
license agreement should be renewed. It goes beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but the license agreement being renewed every year is important for several reasons. Um, Category B, I'd be nervous about just putting down category B rent because that kind of, I mean, and it is kind of gaming the system, this, right, to try and get shared lives carriers the maximum income, but it kind of looks a little bit, uh, I don't know. I'd be inclined to just use the calculator because it's quite simple and quick to do. I would suggest to just use the LHA rate calculator and select one bedroom for that postcode.
And it's best practice to keep the license agreement renewed yearly, isn't it? But we can
Yeah,
send separate guidance on that.
yeah.
It's now 12 o'clock, Michael. That's
Oh,
most of the sort of questions that um, covering what you've been talking about today.
okay, brilliant. If I've missed, we can store the chat, can't we? If we've missed any,
Yeah,
um, I
I've
can
shared
address them.
the rental contribution and the food and utility guidance, but not the other two that you put in just yet.
What were the other two? Oh, yeah, I know.